right, welcome on in, everybody. How are y'all doing today? I hope everyone is having a lovely day. We are here with Dr. Walid Mawass today. Walid is a member, and in fact, a co-chair of one of the early career leadership programs that he's going to be telling us about today. He's also a postdoctoral researcher, and he's going to be telling us about his journey in the sciences. And we are open to any and all questions that y'all have, as always. Walid, welcome on in. How are you doing today?
Awesome. Thanks, Bill. I appreciate you having me on. I'm feeling good. Really excited to chat for however long it takes, and excited to share with you whatever you guys want to know, whether it's about my personal journey or diving deep into science and science adjacent stuff.
So, Walid, we just kick it off, as we always do, with just tell us a little about yourself now. So, where are you located now? What are you doing? And just kind of your scientific mission currently before we go back in time.
Right now, I am in Tucson, Arizona. So in the southwest of the United States at the University of Arizona. And I work as a postdoctoral research associate at the theoretical population genetics lab that we have here. And I work specifically with Professor Joanna Maisel, who's pretty well known in the field. And it's a very exciting lab to work with. It's very small but very vibrant lab because she really promotes cross-disciplinary work. So it's quite exciting for me as a population geneticist to be, rubbing shoulders with other people who are doing protein evolution and bioinformatics. And so you can see there's a lot of stuff going on in the lab to excite you, scientifically speaking, especially.
So I have a naive question for you, and then we have a first-time chatter as well from Java Source. Welcome in, Java, who's also actually a bioinformatician, as it were.
Awesome.
What is theoretical population genetics?
Great question. So let's start by deconstructing it by just answering what is population genetics, because genetics by itself is, for those who took high school biology, is pretty self-explanatory. But population genetics specifically as a field is just trying to understand how the genetics of a whole population can change in time or in space, or from whatever mechanism we're interested in understanding, natural selection or other random processes that could affect how the frequencies of genes, their dynamics, the number of, for example, recessive alleles for that impact some diseases. Those are all come down underneath the umbrella of population genetics, which is a very, very big field. And so when we step into theoretical pop gen, it's, as the word implies, it has less to do with actual data that you've gotten from the field. When you go sequence people, you go get data from actual populations, and it has to do more with using tools such as mathematics and computational algorithms to try to answer the same questions you might be interested in. And so it's amazing to think that you could use a computer and construct in it a population of genomes, which is, a bunch of genes together bundled into an individual. So that's essentially what we do in the lab. We just, in a computer, we can simulate a whole population filled of genomes and then write programs that allows it to move along in time and change in whatever way we want it to. And then we study it.
So what is the goal? Like, why does one do something like this?
In terms of
like you build
theoretical,
yeah, so like building this population you have and you run a simulation, like what are we learning from this kind of work? And also, another naive question, what kind of computer do you use to do something like this? 'Cause that seems to be like probably a really powerful computer you would need.
all right, I'll start with the last question since it's easier to answer. So it really depends on what you're trying to do. If you want to, you want to replicate what is in nature, and so you need a large amount of people, you are going to need a computer that has a lot of resources. It's going to need a lot of memory. It's going to need a lot of space. However, you can scale all of that down. You don't have to go as far as say I want to be able to simulate a population of 5,000, 10,000, whatever. You can scale it down, and then using, the magic of mathematics, you figure out how to upscale the results that you get. And so you don't need a very, intensely crazy constructed computer to write essentially what in the field we call an evolutionary model. And the way you write it, the way you construct it, is with language, programming language, which you can use whatever you want. The earliest evolutionary models were written, if people in the chat know, with languages such as Pascal, such as Fortran, very old languages. And nowadays we either use C, Python, languages that allow you to recreate the processes that we see in nature. For example, you want to recreate how a parent creates a child. So you're creating a generation of parents and a generation of children. You can do that essentially with properly using those languages.
So that is really cool. Does that mean that you take existing phenotypes that you see in nature? For example, in nature you see that these populations reproduce in this particular way. And so you take those observations, you program it into your software, and then you run the algorithm. You say, like, let's say that there's this mutation that pops up. How long does it take to happen?
Essentially, you can do all of that. You can do all of that. The complexity of it will really depend on the question that you want to answer. If you're just interested in something as simple as you want to follow a mutation a long time, that is simple compared to you want to follow a bunch of genes all linked together in one individual, and you want to see how their frequencies change along with time. And those things, like you mentioned, are based on what we observe in nature. So you're anchoring yourself in, what do I see in nature? What are some of the processes that are really hard to study in nature because we can't manipulate everything, especially on the genetic level. And so we come to these tools of computer simulations. Today I'm gonna remove some of these very, very tough complexities to simulate, and then boil it down to some essential parts of it that I can simulate, and then see what kind of insights do I get. Is something unexpected? Do I see what is expected? Do we observe exactly what we observed in nature? And then you follow along the scientific method in that way, in terms of trying to either confirm or disconfirm a hypothesis that you have, or multiple.
That's really, really cool, and it seems like you'd have unlimited possibilities as the kind of code that you could write and build on, like, because you said, like, single genes, linked genes, small populations, big populations. I'm betting you can introduce variables of new populations coming in and how it affects the existing one. So
there's a lot of stuff you can do.
Yeah.
Like, just for example, when I came into this postdoc position, the program was already built by a former postdoc and PhD student. And so they already had a base of what is specifically called a forward time evolutionary model. That means the population that you created is moving forward in time instead of looking in the past. And so when I came in, I have a specific biological question that I'm interested in. And so that might require me to add parts to that model. I might have to tell it to do things that the model didn't have before. So then you step into this role of adding features to that model, and then it increases in complexity. It increases in terms of how do you maintain connectivity between those different parts, so your whatever result that you get is still, interpretable or coherent for you.
Yeah, because there could be many ways where it doesn't make sense anymore, right? And versus other ones that do, and how do you figure that out, right? So
that's why vigilance.
Yeah.
It's a big trait in scientists, is to be very vigilant about One thing that is amazing is the diversity in science is, I think, especially in the public eye, is very unappreciated because you do have the sense of the scientist as a monolith, white coat wearing person with flasks and things working on them. And maybe that image is changing with time, hopefully. But there's a lot of diversity in scientists and in the science that they do. For example, when you take me, where I work in what's called a dry lab setting, where I don't do any actual manipulation with any organism or anything at all. I just work on a computer. And so you have scientists that, they concern themselves with building experimental designs. They have to figure out how to properly design an experiment to give them the results that make sense. While in my case, it's not only an experimental design, but I am making sure I write a program that can simulate what we see in nature. And so what underlies that is being vigilant about the steps that you do. In terms of the language, if we're sticking to, in my example, in the language that you're using to write the different processes and your interpretation of the results, and being vigilant in not over-interpreting. It's what my PI tells me, never be too excited about the first results that you get. Be excited that the program worked and it outputted something for you, but never be excited about what you see, because most likely is the wrong results.
So I know we're getting into the nitty gritty now, but I'm just fascinated by how do you know, like when you're writing this program to simulate what you see in nature, and Javasaurus in chat says you're a science leech as well, because Java is also a bioinformatician. You're writing this program, trying to figure out how something works. You're trying to be vigilant to make sure that everything's appropriate, but how does one even know what is an appropriate step? Because the thing that you're modeling may not have been seen before in nature. Like, it's based off foundations in nature, but how do you know that the answer is as you're saying, like, as correct as it can be for our knowledge that we have?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I figured out that answer a little bit more in my postdoc, which is, as humans, we have a very amazing tool at our disposition that a lot of fields use, which is mathematics. Which is that math essentially allows us to build models, and that models could be a lot of types, but the simplest model is this kind of black box where it's going to take in some input that what it is in nature. Let's take, for example, some inputs are, that inside that black box, you've got those genomes and individuals. What some of the inputs are going to be, the resources that they get, the kind of factors, environmental factors that can impact their survival or other things. So those are inputs into your model, or some parameters into your model that you can put in. And then you have outputs that also you can recognize, because you know what you want to get out of your models. You want to look at the allele frequency, you want to look at the population size or the fitnesses or whatever you're trying to follow. And so when you want to go into that black box, that's when mathematics helps you build those processes, like you're saying, that you either see in nature but that you don't really know what is its foundational or fundamental aspects of it, or things that you're not really sure how it's happening or working in nature. And so, to give you some insights and link it back to our first question about theoretical population genetics, theoretical population genetics actually has its history rooted in the beginning of the 20th century, where you had a few brilliant polymath people, not specifically just purely geneticists, but polymath, very good with mathematics, very good with other aspects of science, building these mathematical models of how genetics evolve in a population. Literally, it's just variables, numbers, differential equations, stepwise equations, whatever you want that just describe these processes. Now, of course, you've reduced what you see in nature, but the best way in science to get insights is that you have to take off these layers and look at the fundamental things underneath it. And so people like, I'll throw off some names that people in the chat might be interested in looking up, and it could be people like JBS Haldane is one of the earliest people who was brilliant in his ability to write mathematically things like how natural selection impacts the frequency of an allele. And then when he builds that model, he can look at the results mathematically and he can interpret it and say, well, if I set the selection to be this powerful, if I start at a allele frequency at this value, then this is what I see. This is what you should expect. And then later on, with that foundational model there, that theoretical model, then you have other scientists who are more empirical, who'll go and measure things in nature when we have the good tools and methodologies to do that, and then they compare. And then they can be like, we either confirmed what Haldane actually told us through the tool of math, or it was not confirmed, and we have to look at a different way of understanding this phenomenon. And so that's how I know that my model, the way I'm writing it, is supposed to be correct, because I am writing a mathematical representation of what's going on. So when I write that a parent is going to, have what we call a gamete, which is that sex cell that comes out of them, and then it's going to be combined by a sex cell from another parent to give a new individual, if we're talking in strict diploidy. So I write that mathematically. I have to write it in a way where it's in a mathematical form, that I have to take, with a certain probability, these genes with a certain probability these genes, and they combine in a certain way, and then I associate a certain value. So it's very numerical, it's very mathematical, but it's amazing in the fact that you're still describing a biological phenomenon in it.
That's really cool to be able to take information that you have on the computer that informs how you decide and design a field study, or not even in the field, but the wet bench side of things, and then right back to you, and presumably the model keeps getting better and better, informing
Yes.
real life events, that's amazing that you're able to
Absolutely.
do that.
That's the important communication between theoreticians and empiricists, which sometimes in the history of science tends to fluctuate, where empiricists become too rigid in terms of their reliance, in terms of what they interpret as the actuality of what's going on in nature, relying too much on the hard data that they see, and then the theoreticians, which they become encamped in that their math is strong and their math is really precise, and so what they see should be the correct thing we observe. And so that communication can break down because they could have very different views about certain phenomenons, and then sometimes they communicate well with each other. And certainly what's going on right now in this century, in the 21st century, where you have a lot of communication, like you said, and yeah, that makes the science much better, because when I write something like the models that I work in here, and I have an empiricist that actually works with a population in nature and they study it genetically, they will see the insights that I have, and that will allow them to formulate their questions differently, to think about perspectives a little bit differently, and then they come to me with more information about actual populations in nature, telling me like, we've actually observed these values for those parameters, or we've actually noticed this kind of thing going on that you don't have in your model, maybe you should include it.
And the back and forth keeps making both better. Yeah. Feedback exchange, as Golganak says. Java says, sounds like a large language model might be cool to have a look at your genetics theorems. Not really to predict, but to verify. Let them tell you how. Let's chat moving. Let them tell you how likely it is that the changes that you've seen make sense in their natural sequence, just like a human language. Which would be a really cool aspect of it. So
there are studies. Sorry to cut you off, but there are studies already that are using these large LLMs to understand sequences, because if we read sequences as in the genetic code with the 4 letters, you can use an LLM to try to read those things for you and give you some insights, right? One of the things that LLMs such as what we, commonly now all of us know, like ChatGPT and others, um, they can fail at you because they might not have that much insight just from reading your code or reading your model or reading whatever your results are. They don't know the actual context or the insights that you're trying to extract. And so they might reach conclusions just based on their reading of it that you or myself as an expert, I'm supposed to know to have the actual underlying knowledge to understand it. It's a good tool, but I don't know if you've seen certain recent reports that even like common LLMs, especially like commercially oriented ones, are either purposely or not purposefully being made dumber. You know, um, and so to the extent of the on the scientific field, I've seen work where LLMs are being used in reading sequences, which I think is going to be really, really cool. Because when we sequence like plants that have giant, giant genomes and a lot of repetitive parts, having LLMs read all those stuff and kind of figure out some patterns or figure out certain things, it'll give us a lot of quick insights that might, offer some shortcuts for scientists, which is we all love shortcuts.
Nice. So, Walid, you're coding populations in a computer in the heat of Arizona. How did you get here? Where did this all start? Where did first you talked a lot about mathematics, for example, the importance of mathematics in your field. Where a lot of kids, for example, like, either fall in love with science or don't at a really young age. And mathematics is sometimes a barrier for that. So at what point did you really start going on that science route, before undergrad even? And how did you know that this is a passion that you wanted to pursue?
All right, so that's gonna be a question that I'll make sure that I don't digress a lot on, and I'll make sure that I answer your question because I feel like your question really hits on a lot of important parts that I've seen, including myself. I've seen a lot of my colleagues suffer with, and their decisions in terms of where they want to continue in their career path becomes difficult to pick because of these things. Like, how comfortable are you with mathematics? How comfortable are you with other aspects that a lot of us overestimate how important our knowledge has to be to succeed. And so I can tell you right from the bat that my math was not that good coming into this postdoc. So I have to start from a place where I knew that my foundation was not very strong in terms of understanding the things that I'm working on. And that was a conscious choice by myself to be like, recognizing when I was finishing my PhD that I am lacking in these aspects, so I should go, since a postdoc is considered still as a sort of a mentoring position, that I should go and get trained in these things that I know I'm weak in. I know I need more knowledge and more formation around. And so that was my active choice of coming here, to get my math stronger, get my theoretical pop gen much, much stronger, and I feel like I am getting there. But that's the point where the encouragement has to come from two sources. It has to come from your internal confidence in what you want to do. In my case, it's knowing that I want to be a scientist, and knowing I want to be a scientist in academia, and knowing that I want to do research on these topics. And then it has to come from an external source, where people who encourage you to continue on your path, or people who are encouraged by your development and want to help you with it, they give you the right tools. And what I mean by tools, I don't mean like giving you the right textbook or giving you the right link. I'm talking about giving you the right tools mentally and emotionally and psychologically for you to be able to escape from certain things that plague us in different fields, but especially talked about in science, like imposter syndrome or the fear of failing. And a lot of these things that I have noticed that are not conversations that are had either between peers or between mentor and mentee. And I was lucky. I was very lucky that my mentor was the type where the tools that she gave me really helped me feel like I can succeed in this and I can learn and I can apply. And I can apply without fear of making mistakes. And, the tools that I was given and the encouragements that I was given weren't like, oh, don't worry, it'll click for you if you keep going with the math. It's understanding that, math is just a tool. It's another type of language to express what you want to do and what you want to work on. And knowing that language is huge. And in your daily life, you don't use every word that is in that language. You don't use every type of rule that is in the language that is there. And so it's the same thing. Math is crazy big, has a lot of aspects to it, but you don't need to know all of it. You just need to get to the things that you need to get to that scientific question that you're trying to answer. And the more you're comfortable with that part of that mathematical foundation, the more you're comfortable with what you're doing. The more confidence you start having. And one suggestion that I would give to people in the chat that might be interested, or to anybody who's watching this, is never be afraid to try different things. Like, if you want to get better at math, the solution is not always to just jump first into mathematics. It isn't always the solution to go into Khan Academy and type in intro to math, because a lot of these aspects are interconnected. And so my way of actually getting better at mathematics, where I knew during my undergrad studies and during my grad studies and my PhD, I wasn't very mathematically savvy, is because I was very savvy in statistics and probabilities. So that's one door where you can walk in, learn these aspects, and then allow yourself to, from that room, when you feel comfortable in it, step into a more pure mathematical aspects. So to give like a few more details on that, and I don't want to make presumptions, but this is anecdotally from what I've seen. A lot of people confuse mathematics and statistics, but essentially they can be connected, but they're not exactly the same fields. They actually have very differing histories. And sometimes they overlap, sometimes they don't. And so you can actually study statistics and probabilities without having very strong mathematical background, because these aspects have to do with less with like understanding, differential equations or calculus or linear algebra, and more with being able to work with actual data. When you go into stat and probabilities and being able to work with actual numbers and values and understand how these things happen, that is a way to feel comfortable with that field. And that was my journey. Is in my PhD, I was doing more work that is known as, in the field, as quantitative genetics. It has to do more with studying genetics and phenotypes. So like, the traits, characteristics that we're interested in studying, whether it's diseases, whether things like height and weight and all those stuff and body size. Quantitative genetics is interested in studying those things genetically. But quantitative genetics, compared to like theoretical population genetics, is more stat-based. A lot more stat-based. And that's what I learned. That's the formation that I had in my PhD, which I did in Canada before moving into the US. And those things were not things that I was very comfortable with as well. trust me, like there are some times you do feel like, do I want to keep going at this because I'm not understanding anything? And it took a while for me to just give in to the fact that it's okay not to know, and that the more I work on understanding it, take a break away from it, and come back to it, the more my brain feels capable of forming those relationships and keeping them in, instead of like trying to, shove everything and stuff it into my brain and not getting it at all.
So
And so,
your journey,
go
Walid,
ahead.
is very brave, I would say, because you're going into fields like what you said in your PhD program, where you're not necessarily stats heavy. You're going into a stats heavy program, right? And now that you're for your postdoc, you're not really math heavy, like you said. It's two different languages, and now you're jumping into something that's math heavy.
Yeah.
So, what about what about yourself do you feel motivates you to go in those directions, and what draws you to those directions? Because that's not what every scientist does. Like, a lot of scientists, will stay in, let's say, fruit fly genetics, but maybe just a different aspect of it. This feels like it's almost field jumping that you're doing to bring together eventually different languages and fields to answer a bigger question.
That's very, very a very interesting way of putting it, because even though I knew that I did that, I didn't overthink it, because I think I came with an understanding of internally in myself what I enjoy doing, which is doing science and doing research, and then also understanding that the things that I'm interested in studying are not covered in one field. They're not covered in just one way of doing it. And so when I was in my PhD and doing it one way, I was coming at the end of it and being like, I do not want to be entrenched in that one way. And so the cool thing about genetics, especially evolutionary genetics, is that it has multiple fields. And so when you jump from field to field, you can still try to tackle the same questions, but now you have to have a slightly different foundation of how you're doing it, a slightly different way of looking at the problem. And I was excited by that. I was excited by the fact that I don't want to be entrenched in one way of looking at things. I want to figure out other ways of looking at the same problem. And so what I want to study is the observed variation that we see in the world, right? All that diversity that we see has a basis in genetics. And that's what motivates a lot of scientists to study genetics. And so the same applies to me, and I want to study the genetics that, underlie all this amazing diversity that we see. But what I'm most interested in is these traits that are what we refer to as complex traits. So you can have a trait that is impacted by one gene or two genes, what is referred to as a Mendelian type trait. That's a little bit easier to study because you're only following one or two genes. But you have, on the flip side on that spectrum, you have traits that are impacted by thousands of genes on your in your genome. Well, the same tools that you were using to study that Mendelian disease is harder to apply when you have to follow 1,000 things at the same time. So that is the real aspect that I'm interested in studying. And so when I was in my PhD and I was doing that, I was using a set of tools in doing that, which is the quantitative genetics set of tools. I had that belt of QuantGen, right? Applying models in a way, understanding stat, and using that to understand things. And then I got to a point where I was like, yeah, but that's not the only belt to actually get at that question. I need to know how a different tool belt feels like. Is it heavy? Is it going to be heavy on me? Because if it is, I can just go back to the thing I was comfortable with. But what is cool now is that I can see that not only the tool belt is not that heavy, the amount of tools that I have at my disposition now is a lot more. And so that's awesome for me, because not only does it help me in how I want to tackle scientific and research questions, but that means I can switch between different languages and how I think of things. So, for example, you ask me a question about, yeah, talk to me about, the evolutionary genetics of this kind of trait that you studied. Now I can talk to you about it in a quantitative genetic language and in a population genetic language, which can be different. Even though they're both tackling the same question, even though they both fall under the same field of genetics, they're different languages. And that connects back to a great idea, which is still, a very debated topic in science, which is the importance of cross-disciplinary dialogue and feedback within an individual and across individuals. So within yourself, if you move across disciplines, and between different individuals that are from different disciplines. Because we're all trying to find answers to sometimes the same questions, or we are all trying to figure out what are the best questions to this thing that we're looking at.
Yeah.
And the more you bring people from different backgrounds, I think you succeed at looking at the problem in a better way.
Absolutely. And I like your tool belt analogy as well, that now you're wearing, double the tools, but they're not weighing too heavy, and now you have more ways to answer the same question.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be the path. That was the path that I chose. So I have no qualms with somebody that's like, I want to stick with studying Drosophila, and I want to use, this experimental quantitative genetics. Good, because then they're going to know their tools so well that they're going to be very proficient in it. And then whenever they publish a paper or they come out with some report, I'm going to trust them. There's this inherent trust in their knowledge because of how much time they trained and studied this tool. Now for me, because I am trying to combine both an empirical and theoretical aspects, I would tell people to, it's not like I'm fully entrenched in one, right? I'm trying to combine different ways of looking at things, but the answers that I'm trying to give, I'm trying to make them a bit more holistic because we look at the same problem in different ways.
Absolutely. And we also had a first-time chatter, Lady Lara Croft. Welcome on in. And guys, remember, if you have any questions at all, feel free to drop in the chat. Walid will be more than happy to answer your questions about his work or his journey. And speaking of your journey, so I always found this was really this is an interesting element too, is how did you identify where you wanted to go to undergrad, and did you know already that you wanted to go into research, or is it something that you identified when you were in undergrads? Because that's always some folks, it's halfway through undergrad, you're like, I think I want to do it. Other times you come in there like, I know I want to do this thing. And what gravitated you towards your lab eventually as in grad school? Like, what framed you in undergrad to get you to that point?
I think I had an affliction to science early on, even from undergrad, even before undergrad. I think I had
an affliction. I like how you're phrasing it.
I would say that because I tend to, even things that are hobbies or things that are of a leisure nature, I still kind of, they're connected to either science or connected to genetics or evolution and biology to me. So and that comes from a very, very early time of me being very interested in learning about genetics, and then very interested in learning about evolution. And so those things kind of slowly started directing me into science, and then from science into there's always also that weird epiphany, let's say, in some cases, where you're in high school, you're studying all these topics that we call science, right? But you're not studying science at all. You're getting topical things. You're learning about biology, you're learning about chemistry, you're learning about physics. You're not learning what science is. And so there is a sort of this kind of realization that, okay, I'm very interested in biology, I'm very interested in genetics, and then you realize that there's actually a scientific enterprise that works in creating knowledge about these aspects. And so when I found that out, I was like, wow, that's where I want to be. I want to be in a place where I can apply my curiosity that I know that I have into trying to answer certain questions that I find interesting and then sharing those answers with other people. And because I personally think that my drive towards knowledge and the application of science doesn't only come from me being interested in it, me being like, I want to understand this, so that's why I jumped into it. I feel like I want to come out with answers to help everyone understand. It's like I have like already a collective context in my mind about why I want to do science, not just an individual context. And to me, that has been following me everywhere, because that also is the basis of why I joined the GSA and why I joined associations and everything, because there's collective context in my head always about how do you do science, how do you do research, what do we do about academia, how do we fix academia, right, and stuff like that. To me, there's always this collective context in my head of how we can find these answers, how we can ask those questions. And so the journey was really about having that realization that, okay, now I know what science is. It isn't what I understood it to be as studying biology in high school, or even studying biology at university level in my home country of Lebanon. And so when I knew I wanted to get into research, then, there's one path and one path only, which is you've got to rack up diplomas. You have to go in and you have to train pedagogically, you have to train in an educational manner to get yourself to a place where you can get your master's, you can get your PhD, and then you're trained enough to do science. That's just how it works. And so I knew that that's the path I have to follow, and that's where I put myself in. And I moved for undergrad to France, and from there I was more exposed to more of the science aspect of the biology, more of the science aspect of things that have to do with evolution and ecology and genetics and all those cool topics. And from there I took it further, that I don't just want to learn. I don't just want to sit in class, take notes, and learn about why natural selection picked out this weird feature or this trait in this species of birds. I want to study these stuff and try to learn in that way. And so I got an opportunity to go to Canada, in Quebec, to do exactly that, to get master's and PhD, but also be a full-time researcher. And I took that opportunity very quickly. And I was also lucky enough to have a very understanding, very helpful PI who really helped me throughout those years. And I got even more connected to those things that I really liked. And I think I should say I feel quite lucky in how things aligned to actually work that way. A lot of these opportunities come by chance. It was by chance that I saw an ad of a master's PhD program in Canada that I got to apply to, right? Certain things are just that way. And it's really by chance that I got to, complete a journey where it started from a, young adolescent, or young adult, sorry, getting into genetics and evolution and wanting to be involved in it in a professional way, and then being able to actually do it, right? Not everybody gets the same opportunities. And I think being aware of that is something that I try to hold on to as best as I can.
That's a really good way of looking at it. And actually, I'll have questions about that as well. But
Yeah, I'd love to take some.
what did you work on in undergrad? Just like or not in undergrad, sorry, in graduate school. Like when you took that opportunity in Canada, what got you excited about the work, and then what was your work? What were you working on and doing?
In grad school, what excited me about it was like the subject matter was exactly what I wanted to. It was studying human genetics. It was studying human evolutionary genetics, and I was like, that's exactly what I'm gonna do. I didn't particularly care about the study organism, but it was very exciting opportunity. So that just like got me into a place where like, okay, I was studying evolution and ecology in France, and then I had opportunity to go into what I really want, which is evolutionary genetics, and I just full on just embraced it. And so in terms of the actual details of the project, it's a very, very, very cool project. And I will try my best to tell it as a story instead of just telling you what the project is. I'll tell it to you as a story that can actually show you what the motivation of how the project came to be. In Quebec itself is a very interesting human migration example, because you had a small amount of French migrants who moved to colonize the area, and created what was referred to as New France at the time. That was, you had the French migrants who went to the south of North America, starting with the Louisiana colony and all that, and you had some that were sent to the northern areas, which we now know as Quebec. And so the expansion of those settlers in that area, and their continuation. One aspect about them is that because of their Catholic background, there is this interconnectedness between the establishment of parishes in the area, and so you had this amazing migratory movement where people would move along the area along the St. Lawrence River and in other internal areas. They would establish parishes first. And so a parish is like a small chapel or a church or whatever. They would establish it there, and then more people would move into the area and to settle, exploit the area in terms of resources and all of that. And there's a lot, and the cool thing is that these parishes kept really good records of marriages, and in some cases acts of birth, acts of deaths. And so those, thanks to a two big projects in Quebec, which I'll shout out to, is the Balzac project. Another one is the PRDH, which is like the Human Demography Project in Quebec. They were able to, in the 70s and 80s, to use all those acts with civil acts to reconstruct the whole genealogy of those settlers that came to what we know as Canada in the early 17th century, sorry, and then down to people who are alive today in Quebec right now.
That is really cool.
Right? So you have genealogies that are deep in time, that can span up to, I think, 9 or 10 generations. All right? So when that, to a scientist, is, wow, licky, that's data for me. That's amazing. And so that's what people did in the 70s and 80s and 90s. A lot of these demographers, geneticists, a lot of these people who were interested in using this data found amazing stuff, right? They started answering a lot of amazing scientific questions using those genealogies. And essentially, that's the project I worked on. And that's the cool thing about science. You have the set of data that people have already asked a lot of interesting questions, but you can always keep asking questions. You can always try to figure out something that you're interested in understanding. And in this case, the project that I worked in was trying to understand how certain traits evolve in time, and if they can evolve very fast. And the PI that I worked with, my supervisor at the time, already had a paper that showed a very interesting result of that kind. And my work was extending it even further by asking questions about other areas in Quebec, the historical population, just to be clear, and answering other questions that are related to how these traits can evolve by natural selection and other things that can impact its evolution. And that was like exactly what I wanted to be doing, right? I felt in a place where like remembering my 16, 17-year-old self that was like reading commercial books about evolution and genetics and natural selection, and me just trying to, suck up all this information that I'm not getting from my high school or university, and then to become a, luckily to become a actual professional scientist that applies these things and studies them. And it's cool. And again, I want to stress, there is an aspect of luck in it, because not everybody gets the right opportunities to put them somewhere, or they don't always have the resources to actually allow them to move from one path to another that more aligns with what they want. It's not always easy. And so I was lucky in that sense.
So, just on that front as well, you moved around a fair bit, right? You starting in Lebanon to France to Canada to United States. As you're saying, a lot of it is just you have to jump at these opportunities. How do you know when it's time to jump for this opportunity? Because moving to a different state within a country is a big deal, right? You moved
Yeah.
countries multiple times to pursue this passion. Could you just enlighten us, like what you learned along the way, and what you felt like were they valuable experiences at the end? The moving through the countries, like would you have done it again, and what challenges did you face with that?
I do not regret anything that I did. And I think, we're talking specifically about the experiences that I did, whether it's professionally or pedagogically. I do not regret anything that I did, because, you know, sometimes you've got to jump on an opportunity because you make out of it what you can. And sometimes the opportunities are not that good. Sometimes they're really good. And you just got to figure out, if you decide to go in it, you just got to figure out if it is the case or not. And if it wasn't that good, that happens. You've just got to take out of it what you've done, and then try as best as you can to grab a better opportunity. Because now you have, to use a technical term, you have prior knowledge. You're geared to now know what a bad opportunity in science is, to try to identify a better opportunity for yourself. And one suggestion that I would give, because that's from my personal experience, is when you're in an opportunity, in a certain situation by choice that you made, you have to, as best as you can, to focus on yourself. And what I mean is not to be like competitive or single-minded. I'm talking about that when you are, doing some research, you have an internship, you're meeting people, always try to take an opportunity to self-reflect on how you are changing. Mentally, psychologically, emotionally. How are you feeling about where you are? How are you feeling about the people that you're meeting? And when you give that opportunity to yourself, you're creating that important internal feedback loop to gain knowledge about what works for you and what doesn't work for you. And so when you do go to another opportunity, you can use that knowledge to be like, I know where things work for me and where things don't work for me. And that's one thing that in academia is missing, is that grads, and I would even would say undergrads, but grads and postdocs and people at those different levels, that for them to understand that they could set rules for themselves and for others on how certain conducts and how certain things happen, whether it has to do with the work or it has to do with interpersonal relationships, because you want to succeed. And to succeed, you have to realize that as much as your PI or supervisor can sets an environment, you have to also modulate the environment for yourself as best as you can, right? And then you can realize, like, oh, I know the personalities I clash with. I know the certain things that I'm not okay with when they happen at the workplace. And so when you experience it one time and maybe it felt really hard, really sad, really difficult to deal with, and I can totally understand these things, work on what it means to yourself and less externally what it means that a person was, not good, okay with you, or somebody was, mean to you, or somebody was disrespectful or offensive. And I hope that by doing these things and encouraging them, that will be complementary to the work that we want to do collectively on how to have a better, academic environment, how to have a better, relationships between each other as humans first as well, and then as colleagues and scientists.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Even Chad Javasaurus says this hits a little bit home. Your message there. So yeah, it's a big one.
Yeah,
would you say?
I would say I would say, and I tell this to all the people that I meet, whether I meet them in a sort of formation type where we're having, any kind of workshop or whatnot, or people that I are my direct colleagues. I always tell them, never shy away from reaching out to another person about your issues, because if that other person doesn't relate, they could understand. And if they can understand and know that, all you need is some validation and some reassurance of that you are worth, things will brighten up.
Mm-hmm.
As much as, sometimes they can seem very bitter and dark.
And do you feel that your journey, especially again going from those different countries, like again starting in Lebanon to France to Canada to the US, were those, like, what kind of difficulties did you endure as like a scientist moving to a different country? Because that's also not just a limiting factor for scientists but many a people, right? And so were there difficulties like transitioning to new country? I'm sure there's always the immigration paperwork and everything, but just like culturally between labs and countries, and how did you, like, what did you learn about that, and how did you actually approach those differences?
Yeah, look, in terms of immigration difficulties, I won't get into those because those are things that a lot of people will face.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's not a lot of insights that I can bring into it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
But the difference in the sciences between, like, let's say, is there a difference between a lab in France and a lab in Canada and a lab in Arizona?
Yeah, that absolutely there is. Yeah, in those terms, there is, because the bottom line is all those labs are made up of people, and those people have their own personalities and their own anchored culture that they work based on. And when you go from France, which is a different culture, when you go to Canada, it's a different culture, especially Quebec, and then you go to Arizona, yeah, the culture is going to be different. Though I would say, when I was in, when I moved to Arizona, to Tucson, the thing that made me feel the most comfortable is that my lab has a good amount of international students and international colleagues. So there is this multifaceted aspect of backgrounds, and so there is no monotone culture that is going on there. So that's really nice compared to like in Canada or in France, where most of the people I interacted with were all like French, or were all Quebec or Canadians, and so there is this monotony of their culture, and it weighs on you because you have to acclimate, you have to you have to try and understand things from a difficult perspective because that's not the culture you were raised in. There's no guidebook on how to deal with these things. And I don't have an answer to what works. For me, things worked out because I have an inclination to be very, I'll use a term that one of my best friends called me, which is a social chameleon. And I could try to change my colors in a way that are fitting my goals, which is to feel more acclimated and more adjusted. And also another aspect that is privileged is the ability to speak at arrival French fluently, and then in Canada French and English fluently, and then into Arizona English fluently. That massively helps. Massively. And I can't stress enough how much of a privileged um, feature that is for certain immigrants who go to, a different country. Now, of course, just speaking the language fluently doesn't mean that you're going to, integrate to the culture seamlessly or figure out the culture in a way. But that's where, that quote unquote social chameleon quality comes in handy, in that you just, you could, you meld in and you try to immerse yourself in what's going on. Now, it's not easy because it does can sometimes feel like um what's the word, like sort of uh, conflicting, because you don't want to lose of yourself, which is based on the environment and culture you come from, but also not become too much of the culture you're trying to be in, and sort of lose who you actually are, because you start feeling like, am I really this person, or am I pretending to be this person just to feel like I am okay in between these people that are of different upbringing and a different culture.
So,
And you
Ne-
go ahead.
Nelf is wondering in the chat, if would you say that the culture sort of determines the particular lens or way that you would view the problem between these different labs?
Um, yes, because like I said, the major problems that you're going to deal in the labs is those other humans that you have to deal with. When you're going to deal with a computer, culture doesn't come into it. When you're going to deal with certain aspects of your science, it doesn't. But when you deal with the other humans involved, whether your colleagues or other, other humans, whether they're administrators or professors or whatever, yeah, having this cultural lens really helps, because it gives you a perspective on why certain things happen in a certain way, why certain things were said in a certain way. Also, on the flip side, why you understood something in that way, and why your reaction to it was in that sort of way, because we're all molded culturally to, you know use our language in a way, in terms of expression, deal with conflict in a certain way. So many things, like even maybe I don't want to give the impression that it's just the negative stuff. Even in terms of joy, culture plays a role, right? If you're in France and something great happened, the way the culture will, through the people, will express itself is very different than when you're going to enjoy yourself in Tucson, right? It might involve, you know, going out for a drink, but the conversations are going to be different. That lens that you're seeing the world through is going to be slightly different. And so I know it's very difficult, but if you are able as an immigrant to be flexible enough to wear that lens just to help you assimilate, it could do a lot in just in terms of adjusting, because that's the hardest thing for immigrants, is to feel like they have adjusted themselves to where they live now, right? Before, when you're in your home country, adjustment is nothing on your mind, because you're already born into that environment and helped by so many members of your society to feel like you have a place, you have a spot. Well, when you move to a different country, you have to carve that spot out, and then you have to make sure that you're not doing it in a way that, makes you feel isolated, makes you feel like you'll be rejected, because it can happen.
Yeah, and it's a tough balance, and sometimes it takes years before you even start to feel it as you're part of it, especially if you move by yourself to a new country, then it's even more of an isolation feeling.
Yeah.
So, to take us back onto the science side of things, Walid, so once you finished graduate school, you said you wanted to expand your toolkit, right? That's why you went into theoretical population genetics. When in your graduate school career did you start getting that mindset of like, okay, I think I know what I want to do next, and how did you know what you wanted to do next? Because there's options for you after that graduate school outside of academia as well. I know you told us that your long-term plan is to stay in academics, but did that form in graduate school, and if so, like, how did that guide you toward this next position that you're in now?
Um, I think in when I was in Canada, in Quebec, I didn't have this very strong um attachment yet to, my goal being to be in academia. But to be fair, I haven't even decided that, oh, industry is my choice, because I was still in a time where I'm just trying to figure out how to be a good scientist. That was my goal. And a lot of PhD trained researchers are just trying to become good scientists. Um, and so I didn't have that strong, desire yet to be in academia, and why, and a clear understanding of why I want to be in academia. Um, but slowly after the years, it- especially at the tail end of my tenure in Canada, in Quebec, I was thinking that the environment that is created, that involves people of different stages. So, stages in terms of their education: undergrad, grad, postdoc, early career scientist, whatever, professor. And then you have different professional development, where you have technicians, and you have these full-time researchers doing their PhD, and you have all those different positions. I feel like the environment that's formed by them, the type of network that is shaped, is, to me, more appealing than the type of networks that are created inside of industry and in companies, where a lot of times it's a type of industry where you work with other people that are maybe at the same level as you, maybe with different uh, qualifications, but you're in the same group, and then you have a higher level manager, and that has a higher level manager, and the kind of hierarchical organization. So that was one motivation for me. I know it sounds very abstract, but that is really what motivated me, is that the kind of organization that exists in academia, that is based on that type of networking of people of different ages and different uh, positions and different backgrounds, that appealed to me, because I am very fond of um, knowledge transmission. I'm very fond of transmitting knowledge, both, between your peers and um, across across levels. And I feel like in academia you can do that more than you do it in industry. Right? To be fair, I haven't experienced industry to give a very under you know informed opinion. So you shouldn't take my word on like how the actual industry environment is like. But having experienced the academic environment, I'm more inclined to it. But moving to Tucson, the change that happened was, I kept having that feeling that academia is the right place for me. But through conversations with my supervisor, I kept an open mind that there's nothing wrong with the industrial environment, the research that happens in industry, and even then, it's great opportunities to work there if you would like to, if you want to do research. Um, and so yeah, and so the choice of doing a postdoc is regardless of you're doing academia or doing industry. Postdoc is this interesting, position where you're being trained still, you're being mentored, but you are an employee in a way, contractual employee, and but you're still in a way not a full-fledged employee, so there's always room to continue learning, and you can do it whether you decide that you're going to go into industry or you're going to continue in academia.
So, yeah, a very, very wise answer, Walid. Very wise answer. What was in graduate school, if you're able to talk about it, what was the thing that you were most excited to discover? Like, what was something where when you had that eureka moment, or like whether it be a figure in a paper or the whole discovery that you've identified, like what was the thing that you were like, this is really, really cool, like this one particular finding? And same if you're able to talk about it in your postdoc work. I know you might not be able to talk about it because it's unpublished, but if you can like get us a glean as to what really excites you data wise, where you're just like, yeah, let's go.
Let me see. You gotta think about the most exciting one. I think the most exciting one from my PhD is and a result that in the most layman way that I could put is showing that when a trait is changing or evolving through the action of natural selection, that the way that trait will respond to natural selection is actually also impacted in the way the genetics and the environment interact with each other. So there are certain interactions that we call genotype by environment interactions. The result that was this amazing result that I enjoy thinking about is the fact that I demonstrated empirically that it can influence how that trait can respond to natural selection. So that was a great result, and that's a published result also if people are interested in checking it out. Though I would say it's a very meaty paper. My work is not for the faint of heart or for the uninitiated, because it's a lot of stat, it's a lot of modeling, and it's a lot of insights that have to be gleaned out of those things that can seem very abstract. From my postdoc, it's there's I don't think there's with the preprint world, I don't think there's a lot of like I know some PIs have reservation about sharing results or whatnot, but to me it's part of the communication of what we do as scientists and what are the questions that we try to understand, because sometimes the questions we're working on are so granular that it's totally valid for any person to be like, why are you interested in that? That seems totally like, what do we benefit out of that, right? And I totally agree. But sometimes attacking those granular gaps still helps, because the next time somebody's going through that field, they won't stumble into that gap because you filled it up by studying it and working and understanding it. I hope that analogy makes sense.
Building the foundation for others to build upon, and it's a solid foundation by having, and it's kind of like how you said with the culture that kind of you're looking for is one where it's like already very collaborative, not just between fields. You mentioned between ages as well. Like the exchange of information is just critical to build that solid mass to keep building on top of.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nice.
I think that's exactly what it is. there are other aspects that I could use as argumentations of why I prefer what you just that kind of organizations. It could come from a socioeconomic argumentation, it can come from a solely cultural argumentation, and whatever lens you want to use. To me, those are the conclusions that I got to, that academia is an interesting environment to do that work in.
Mm-hmm.
Again, nobody has said, and I don't think, and I don't know where that comes from actually. Nobody has said, either within academia or outside of it, that academia is a good place. It's just, it's an ecosystem, and you've got to make sure that ecosystem is good for its components. And when the ecosystem is not helping, for example, the mental health of its components, then we got to work on it.
Absolutely.
And yeah, like that's why I still have that motivation that I know that a lot of my colleagues have decided that they don't want to go into it, and that's also valid. Not everybody is required to put energy or time or their thinking into how do I solve issues in academia. You don't have to. That's, again, just like I was saying earlier on, if that's not the environment that you find yourself in by self-reflection, move away from it. Go find a different environment that works best for you. And there are a lot of them.
Absolutely. We have a first-time chatter. Clement, welcome in. Another science stream to nerd out in. Indeed, Clement, we are here with Dr. Walid Mawass. He is telling us about his journey as a bioinformatician, cross-intercontinental journey, in fact. Currently a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Arizona. Walid, tell us... So, as we were talking a little bit about your viewpoints on, that you're going to, the academic circuit and like what you've been studying, how did you end up at the Genetic Society of America in the early career leadership program? And tell us a little bit about what you do there. That's kind of in line with how you've been talking about your personal mission statement.
Yeah, that's a good connecting question, like a good segue. My motivation in terms of like promoting collaboration, promoting the putting emphasis onto that human component of the scientific enterprise is by propping up society groups, associations of these biologists slash geneticists slash whatever profession. But in this case, it's like the Genetic Society of America for geneticists, propping them up in terms of ecosystems where you can learn, you can develop, you can get skills and tools that you might not get in the ecosystem of your lab working with your colleagues. So it's a way of forming yourself in how to manage your time, in forming yourself in how to manage other people, trying to learn the ways that you could be involved in a project that is not a research nature, that is not of scientific nature, but of a social nature, and succeed in doing it. Because, in my opinion, we want to continue as best as we can, especially in the academic field, to bring to light that humane aspect of the scientists. Shed off this idea of a white coat wearing, safety goggles wearing person, right, that is just playing around with chemicals, but an actual human that has wants to connect and wants to apply themselves through those connections, through those relationships. And so, what better way to do it than an association that is literally trying to have members, geneticists of, again, different backgrounds in terms of science and in terms of where they come from, bring them together to help each other in learning these skills, in learning how to build a project together and succeed in doing it, and then helping others, doing projects that not only help you but help other people in that association or people beyond that association. And in two ways, when the scientist goes into the GSA and applies themselves through the CLP program, for example, that is going to be an amazing benefit to the academic scene. And then the other way around, when the general public sees groups like the GSA, and then, understanding that the projects that are built within the GSA are from those scientists, then you have that clear idea that, scientists aren't just sitting there and trying to, play around with mice and dissecting them, but they do have networking workshops. They do workshops where they, talk about leadership. There are workshops where they try to help each other through their problems. If you have a dissertation to present, if you have mental health issues. And so when you show that, you are showing to me, the most important aspect of the scientific enterprise, which is that human aspect, that social component. And I'm proud of so far of just the 6-7 months that I've been part of the CLP, 8 months, sorry, and the work that the members that have been doing in succeeding in those projects, succeeding in their own endeavors and tasks, and I'm glad that the GSA has such a program.
Thank you, Walid. Which projects are you most excited about that are, that you've been helming and that are coming out soon that you'd be interested in telling people about?
Oh, that is awesome. Awesome question. I think one of the most exciting project that I have been involved in is a series of dialogues with leaders in the academic field who are especially concerned with leadership roles and leadership qualities and what it means to be a leader in the scientific academia. And I think why I'm so excited about this series is because I think there are leaders in the wait, you know what I mean? Like, there are people who are undergrads or grads who are, leaders that are not, they're not sure that they're actual leaders. And why I'm saying this is because I feel like those series, when they come out in the format that we're gonna present them in, which hopefully will be like short, digestible videos, I hope that those individuals will hear them, if not learn about what it means to be a leader, for them to glean out of it that quality fits me. That trait is exactly how I would like to apply, my work, or how I would like to do my lab, or how I would like to be part of a project. And then those individuals can identify that maybe I can take up a leadership role. Because there's this insinuation, this maybe it's not even an insinuation, but maybe just this unspoken thing where leaders they become leaders by just through the position that they take, which is not true. A leader is, to me at least, and the little knowledge that I have, a leader is especially about the characters and the qualities that you can display in whatever position you're in. And and I'm so excited for this project, so excited for the individuals that are going to be involved in it, because they are absolutely leaders in being leaders. So that's great. And I hope everybody in the chat to, hop on and watch those videos when they come out, and if you're not remotely interested in academia or science, you might be interested in what it means to be a leader,
because that's, as you're saying, it's humanizing it. You're not a science leader. It's still leadership qualities that you're needing to do, and so you're kind of breaking down that wall of this is a scientist versus a leader. No, it's the same. It can be the same thing sometimes.
Absolutely.
And I dropped in a
Absolutely.
shameless plug for the GSA YouTube page, which will there.
Thank you.
This is where the videos will be housed.
Yeah.
On the same path of demystifying a scientist, Walid, we've had on so far wet bench scientists on the stream. You, as the first dry lab scientist, what is your day to day like? Like, what does a dry lab scientist do?
Okay. I'll say this. I'm excited for the dry lab setting. So you can think of dry lab, which is not a new thing at all. Like people who did mathematical population genetics or theoretical were like essentially dry lab. They didn't go to the field. They just wrote on pen and paper and did math. The only difference is that nowadays with the advance of technology, you don't need to pen and paper anymore. You just have a screen, keyboard, and a mouse, and you're good to go. And so to anybody who is thinking of Java just mentioned it, which is a word that I love to say, my work is in silico. Everything happens within the computer. And the point that I wanted to make was you have to come to terms that you're going to have a very tight relationship with your instrument, which is your computer. And I mean and I don't mean it by you're gonna wake up and you're gonna sit on computer and you're at 5 p.m. you're done. Oh, you're gonna spill some coffee on your keyboard or stuff like that. No. I mean that as a computational scientist, and this is one thing I wanted to reminded me, you called me as a bioinformatician, and this is the little details of the words. A bioinformatician does something very different than a computational scientist. The only commonality is that they both use computers.
Okay.
All right? A computational scientist does a lot of things that have to do with computational operations, like building a model and of populations and letting them evolve. And then a bioinformatician is trying to draw information through stats and algorithms from data, like huge genome data sets.
I see.
Right? But the commonality is that they both will have those tight relationships with their computers.
Mm-hmm.
And to get back to the main point, the tight relationship is that you have to understand the instrument that you are using. For example, when you go to science classes in high school or university level especially, when you're going to be a biologist, what is the one instrument that they focus on? A microscope. They teach you how to use the microscope. They teach you how to look through, cells and whatever, sheets of organisms that you're looking at. But one thing that they always do is that they teach you what a microscope is. They teach you what the microscope does. They teach you why, it works the way it works and how you work it, and you understand this stuff. And that's the same thing that a dry lab person nowadays needs to come to terms with, is that you really need to understand your computer. You have to understand what it means that your computer has a certain amount of RAM or memory. You have to understand what it means that you have a certain amount of CPUs and the speed of the CPUs that they clock in. What that means in terms of the work that you're trying to do. Because that's no longer abstract. When you know that your computer can only manage to offer you 4 gigabytes of RAM, then you know that you can never run something that will ask for more memory than that, unless you want to start, now I'm going into the weeds of it, unless you want to go and take virtual memory from your hard disk. So you see, when you understand your computer, you understand all these aspects, and it'll help you as a computational scientist. And that's what I'm excited about Dry Lab. that's what I'm most excited about, is that there's this amazing new breed of scientists that are like connected to this instrument, which is the computer, and the programming languages. So it's also awesome having people learning new languages. People that are using Python, people that are using Julia, and all of that, and trying to do science, sorry, and write models using those languages. It's very exciting.
For a question from the chat from 3D Prima: do you eventually see these fields kind of converging into like just a global cyber science? Like you said, the difference between computational scientists, bioinformaticians, and presumably there's other subfields too. Or even, are you the intersection point, Walid, between all those?
No.
Because you were talking about stats as well as the predictive.
Yeah, no. I would never assume that I'm the intersection point of anything. No, 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 no. I think the way I think about it is, I am just a pale dot in a huge network of scientists that are working on it. The word cyberspace is pretty amazing. What I would say is the type of cyber science already exists. To give you an example, one of the tools that scientists are using, especially bioinformaticians, because it's a lot of computational resource heavy type of science, where you have data sets that are in the terabytes, and you need a lot of CPU, a lot of computers, a lot of stuff work to do the things you want to do to study those data sets. A lot of people, what they do is they subdivide the work and create a connected network of scientists from around the world, and then they send off everything. And so different people from around the world are doing different parts of the analysis, and then they bring it all back together to have that combined analysis of whatever they all found. And that's one way cyber science used to be done. A more detailed example was the way proteins, a little bit I think 10 or so years ago, the way it used to be studied was in that way. Was, you have a genetic sequence of a protein, you have this internet connected network of scientists, and they work together on understanding different parts of that sequence, and then they combine it at the end. The direction of that will only get bigger. Will only get bigger and bigger. However, what I would say is the inclination to think that some things will converge is always a false assumption to make. Usually things that converge will end up becoming too entrenched and not actually becoming too productive, because you're actually starting to go into a place where you're only able to work on one thing and do one thing, which is not where you really want to go at. That already exists. That's why we have specifically trained people in specific fields, right? And so I don't think things do converge. I think what will happen is a lot of fields will diverge away from each other. And a computational genetics, for example, or computational science will diverge into a lot of things. Bioinformatics will diverge into a lot of things. And the fear there is that by diverging, you lose that flow between them. You start losing that cross-disciplinary feedback that you sometimes need, so you can stay on track. Because what ends up happening is, sometimes when you're at two different lines in that divergence, somebody will come up with a tool that maybe the other people on there already came up with in a different way, and then there's no communication. Then essentially it's a wasted resource and wasted time.
Because each insular component maybe even will make the units themselves, and then without talking,
right?
If you just talk to one another, you could have made one maybe that had the best of both worlds, versus two individual ones that are maybe they work for one purpose but not globally.
Yeah, and that's the power of that kind of element of collaboration, is that I can come and tell you, oh, I read these papers, I think you should read them because they talk about this. Or, oh, I've done work on this and I actually found 1 and 2 and 3 that I think will help you in what you're trying to do. Or, oh, somebody already made that thing. You don't shouldn't spend time on it. Here it is. I'll give it to you, that tool, and then your shortcut for you.
Right. So,
And so if you isolate yourself, you won't get that feedback. And even though you think that, oh, I'm on right path because I'm trying to answer these questions, you're losing out on a lot of important information that might help you.
right, as Java said, the data might converge between the fields, but the applications that you're using maybe won't.
Yeah, that's a good point. That is a good distinction. Yes, in terms of the data, it's already converging a lot because nowadays with dropping sequencing prices and coverage increasing, we're all like almost converging on similar data sets where it's like, oh, we all were working on these huge sequences of DNA, right? Yeah, but but there's something that is interesting about data is that data can be structured. And so even though the data can converge, it's converging in its raw form, but you can still structure it in very different and novel ways that allows you to study it in very different ways. So there's still, not a lot of conversions happening there because you can structure that data differently, right? So let's take, for example, you have this huge database of genomes and sequences and all these letters. You can't study it like that. You have to structure it. So some people will tell you, oh, I'm interested in repetitive sequences. What will they do? They'll go structure that data to find where repetitive sequences are and then focus their work on that. Another question would be like, somebody would be like, oh, I'm interested in, duplication in genes. They'll go and look for structured data. They structure their data to look at that, and that will help them. And so in that sense, you don't have convergence, but in the raw data form, you do converge because, you're going to keep looking. You're still looking at the same source, which is our genetics, our DNA, right? But it's just the way that you organize that data, the way you structure it, that it will always continue to, come up with new ways of doing it.
Absolutely. Yeah, and Chad agrees with you as well, Walid.
Awesome.
So, another question for you as we don't want to keep Walid too late, y'all, because, he's a busy gentleman. He's got a lot of work to do. But we were wondering, what does the future hold for you? Like, what are your goals in terms of career paths? And then you and I have talked offline about you're interested also in like things such as science outreach and science communication. Could you talk to us a little bit about future plans, but also passion side projects that you'd be interested in pursuing in the future?
All right. I'll try to, not plague you guys with some of the disorderly thinking that I can have around all of this, because I can come up with so many projects and then I get stuck in how to like start their application, their actual making them get off the ground. Professionally, I think I do aim to become a researcher and a professor that I could have my own lab to help, essentially for me is not only do research, but, mentor the next generation of scientists who are going to continue, helping us filling those gaps of knowledge and with the aim of bettering the human condition overall. In terms of other side things that I think also serve my personal mission, I think science communication is very important because even though it happens a lot, I don't want to undercut the science communicators that exist everywhere on a lot of platforms. But what I particularly like is that I feel like there is now a platforms where you could apply that science communication alongside a personality that can be appealing to your audience. So in a sense, like right now we're being broadcasted over Twitch, and Twitch thrives on content creators. individuals that have interesting personalities, that have interesting ways of creating their content, and people who watch them and sit in hours in their chat are, for one reason or another, they like that person and they like what they're offering. And so one thing that I am hoping to achieve is to be able to use that format, use that platform to communicate not science specifically, because there are a lot of better science communicators than I am communicating about science, but specifically talk to people about evolution and genetics, and talk about it in ways not in complicated, please, give me a textbook answer of what natural selection is and is not, but talking about them in a way that actually feels impactful to our lives. Because if we all want to agree that we are products of evolution in one way or another, then being able as just normal average person to talk about it and understand it and glean from it just a few things can really be amazing types of conversations. And if I can have those conversations and be that focal point that people can gather around and use me both as a sounding board for their questions, or think that I am interesting enough to hear what I have to say, then that is the science communication that I would hope to achieve.
Yeah,
right. And you say outreach. I don't think it's an outreach in that sense, because people have to make that conscious choice to come and watch you and stay with you, and maybe try to decide not to lurk around and actually communicate and be part of that community building aspect, right? But in terms of scientific outreach, the one project that I have been, for now, I'll say dreaming about, because it hasn't shaped up in any way yet. Where I come from personally, there's a big lack of evolution education. Okay, we can talk about that exists in a lot of countries, even within the USA in certain parts. But I come back to where I came from because I had an experience that was directly related to that gap in education, right? And so one of the scientific outreach that I want to do is being able to construct a module, or being able to construct some kind of format where I can take what I actually do as a job, and I study and teach, and take it to my home country and convince individuals that this is something that ought to be taught, whether it's at the level of schools, parents, or at the level of governmental educational agencies that need to understand that if you don't educate your populace on this topic, they're literally just going to be undereducated. And that happens, that topic happens everywhere. And so I'm excited to try to see if I can start that conversation in my own home country.
And as Chad Golganak says, that in the United States as well, and presumably all the countries you've hit up, actually in your career journey, could presumably use this kind of advocacy for it, because it's not something that you regularly see advocated, nor do you see a particular, at least in my experience, a particular class dedicated to it. And like you said, it's important to have these topics taught in your everyday science class.
I agree with you. I think there are distinctions that to be made. Some countries are better than others. Mm-hmm. In the US, some states are better than others. What I would say is that in France, they do have education on evolution in high school. So there's that topic that is brought up in that sense. And of course, genetics is always taught in a certain way. But the problem is, the miseducation is that you have that clear separation between the two, when clearly whoever has, applied themselves to understanding evolution knows that you can't separate those two.
Yeah.
They go hand in hand.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an important distinction to make, as you're pointing out.
Yeah.
as we're rounding out our stream, I've been asking our guests at the end of every stream of what do you do for fun, Waleed? What do you do just a little bit relax outside of science?
Um, to relax out of science, the one thing I do, I love spending time with my wife, my partner. Spending time with her is like the best relaxation I could ever get out of my work. Like if I want to get out of it, just spending time with her makes it makes everything worth it as like living as a human being, because you don't want to be just defined by the work that you do, and so that's amazing. And in terms of other things that might seem relatable, I am an avid reader and I love to read. And a lot of the things that I try to do is, um, try to read things that can impact me personally in terms of, what the book teaches me. And then at the same time, read books that involve the field that I am from, which is evolutionary genetics or evolutionary biology, and try to see, how other people are communicating that kind of science. Right. I enjoy doing that in my downtime. And on the flip side, I am a musician, and so if I'm not playing music, I am absolutely crazy about listening to music. Like absolutely crazy. Like I have a thing for like I have to, intricately try to understand certain records, certain artists, what they're trying to do with their music, and I love doing that. And that can take a lot of time.
What
That
in,
takes a lot of time, and it's enjoyable.
what instrument do you play?
I play the bass guitar. It's been like 20 years or so,
Nice.
and I had my share I had my share of experiences playing in cover bands for like the last 10, 15 years, and so it's been fun. Um, I should pick that up a little bit more, but this is like the hard part as humans. We're a finite we're a finite point in time, and so whatever time that we have, we gotta use it wisely. And if you can make yourself feel like you're connected to something, whether it's another person or an instrument or a book, then try to develop that as best as you can.
Absolutely, and maybe we gave you a fancy shout out in the stream. Maybe if you start streaming, maybe that could be a redemption that you can play the bass guitar for folks.
Oh yes, yes. If eventually my channel gets up and running, I would love for people in the chat to join. And I promise you this: if you get bored of me, I'll just pick up the bass guitar and just start playing, and then you would not get bored.
It's yeah. Everyone's in the chat's like, it's not an if now. It has to be a when.
All right. I'll apply myself just for you guys.
Glad to hear it. All right. Well, Chad, if you have any last questions to ask Walid, please feel free to ask away. Otherwise, we're going to wind on down for the evening. Walid, thank you so very much for your time and for your really insightful answers and just talking to us about your journey, which I don't know. About you, Chad, I found it inspiring of just how you got to this point, and you're not at all jaded, and the views that you have in open science and collaboration is just a really refreshing thing to hear, and I think resonated with a lot of the members of the community. So thank you so very much for just being a guest on the Twitch stream and sharing again all your knowledge with us.
That's the least that I can do. I mean, I would go as far as say that's what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to share, if not my lived and human experience with you guys, so you can find anything that's relatable, anything that you can understand. It's also giving you a window into things that if not, if maybe you don't have the opportunity to do, not everybody has the time to want to do that, because everybody has so much things they have to worry about, so many things they have to make sure that it's working in their lives, that I'll just sit here and answer your questions and tell you about science and evolution. So you can just enjoy listening to me.
Well, we appreciate the heck out of you, Walid. And this episode
I
will be
appreciate you.
up on the YouTube page in about a week or two, that y'all can go ahead and watch it there as well as on the video on demand here on Twitch. Golgan Access, thank you for your time, your insights, and for taking the time to make the connections, Dr. Mawass. Appreciate your moderation, Balint, and excellent presentation as well. So, Walid, thank you so much for sharing. And I have one more question for you, Walid. I want you to decide where we're going in terms of a raid, where we're taking the audience to. I got two options for you. I have either a classically trained pianist, or I have a game developer, because I thought computers, and there's a little bit of a connection there of you're also the computer scientist, right?
Oh, you got me. Those are two really good choices.
Because of your love of music, I had to go with the music. And we had a first-time chatter with Yogurt Garrel here as well, saying hello.
Awesome. I think I would definitely go with the pianist, because I would love to see that transition into music, and I think we can spend hours just talking about the importance of music in for our evolution, especially, and our experience. So I'll go with the pianist.
All right. Well, sounds perfect. Again, thank you so much, Walid. Last announcement, folks, for those interested out there, the Early Career Leadership Program is accepting new applicants starting tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. So if you're interested in joining Walid as being he's the co-chair of the career, or the words.
Community membership engagement.
Yes, the community membership and engagement subcommittee. You can be on Walid's subcommittee as well, even be a possible co-chair and work with Walid and bring science to the general public. And Walid, again, thank you for your time, your service to the Genetic Society of America, and just your attitude of being this, like, spreading science as part of your career. Not just it's not even out of a sense, it's a sense of obligation, but not as like I have to do this. It's like I get to and I want to do this, and that's a beautiful mindset to have. So thank you so much, my friend, for being here with us.